The summer heat clung to the town of Maplewood like an unshakable embrace. Every corner of the small, picturesque town seemed to simmer under the relentless sun. The roads shimmered with heat waves, the lawns lay parched, and the distant hum of cicadas was a constant reminder that nature, too, was feeling the pressure of July. For the residents, salvation came in the form of a community hub, the Maplewood Pool. The pool wasn't just a place to cool off. It was a summer institution. Families gathered under striped umbrellas, children splashed wildly in the shallow end, and teenagers, with their sunburnt shoulders, lounged lazily at the edges, hoping to impress someone with a daring dive or a perfectly casual laugh. It was the kind of place where time slowed, where the world outside of Maplewood's borders faded, and where everyone, at least for a few hours, seemed to forget their worries. For me, the pool had always been a constant in my life. But that summer, the one before my senior year of high school, it became something more. It became the stage for a story I didn't see coming. My dad was a quiet man, not in the way that he lacked words, but in the way that he chose them sparingly, like they were precious. He was dependable, stoic, and utterly predictable. Every morning, he'd leave the house in his worn blue work shirt, lunchbox in hand, and return at 5:30 sharp, his face set in a mask of fatigue. He'd eat dinner without much fuss, watch the evening news, and retreat to his study with a book until it was time for bed. Our interactions were limited to the essential homework questions, reminders to clean my room, the occasional awkward pat on the back after a big school event. He was there, always, but at arm's length. That summer, however, something changed. I couldn't put my finger on what it was exactly, but there was a subtle shift in the air between us. Maybe it was the heat, pressing down on everyone in town, or maybe it was the fact that I was growing up, edging closer to adulthood. Whatever it was, it began with the pool. It was a Friday afternoon when it all started, the kind of day where the air felt thick and the sun seemed to hang in the sky for an eternity. I had just finished mowing the lawn, sweat dripping from my brow, when Dad appeared at the back door. "Hot out there," he said, his voice neutral as always. He was holding a towel in one hand and a pair of swim trunks in the other. "Thought we'd hit the pool. You coming?" I blinked, surprised. Dad rarely suggested anything recreational, let alone something that involved both of us. Usually, our summer activities revolved around chores or errands. But something about the way he asked like he was trying to bridge a gap neither of us had acknowledged made me nod. "Sure," I said, wiping my face with the edge of my shirt. "Just let me grab my stuff." The drive to the pool was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, rather than companionable. I stared out the window at the familiar streets, the storefronts I'd passed 1,000 times, and wondered why this felt so strange. When we arrived, the parking lot was packed, as usual. Dad parked the car, and we made our way through the gate, the sounds of laughter and splashing washing over us like a wave. The pool was exactly as I remembered it, the glaringly blue water, the smell of sunscreen and chlorine, the lifeguards perched on their high chairs like sentinels. Dad and I claimed a couple of chairs in the shade, set down our towels, and headed for the water. The coolness of the pool was a relief, and for a moment, I forgot about the awkwardness. Forgot about trying to decode the reason behind Dad's sudden interest in spending time together. I floated on my back, staring up at the blindingly blue sky, and let the water carry me. "You've gotten better," Dad said suddenly, his voice breaking through the hum of activity around us. "Your strokes are more controlled." I glanced over at him, startled. He was treading water a few feet away, his expression unreadable. It wasn't much of a compliment, but coming from him, it felt significant. "Thanks," I said, not sure what else to say. We swam for a while in silence, the unspoken distance between us still present but somehow less daunting. I caught him watching me a couple of times, his gaze lingering just a second longer than usual. It wasn't critical or disapproving, it was curious. Like he was seeing me for the first time, not just as his kid but as someone separate, someone he didn't entirely understand. As the afternoon stretched on, the pool began to empty out. Families packed up their coolers and floaties, teenagers shuffled off to wherever they went after hours, and soon it was just us and a few other stragglers. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water. I leaned against the edge of the pool, my arms draped over the side, and watched Dad as he swam a slow lap. There was something different about him in the water. He moved with a grace and ease I didn't associate with the man who spent his days fixing air conditioners and mending fences. In the water, he seemed lighter, freer, like he'd left some invisible weight on dry land. I wondered if this was why he'd brought me here, to show me a side of himself I'd never seen. "You know," he said when he reached my side, his voice quieter now, "I used to swim competitively in high school." I raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, freestyle was my best. I wasn't great, but I enjoyed it." It was the first time I'd ever heard him talk about his own teenage years, and it caught me off guard. For as long as I could remember, Dad had existed in my mind as a fully formed adult, someone who'd skipped over the awkward, uncertain years I was navigating. Hearing him admit to something as ordinary as a high school swim team made him seem more human, more real. "Why'd you stop?" he asked. He shrugged, his gaze drifting to the horizon. Life got in the way, I guess. College, work, your mom, priorities shifted. There was a wistfulness in his tone that I didn't quite know how to respond to, so I didn't. Instead, we floated there in silence, the water lapping gently against us, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like there was a chasm between us. It felt like we were sharing something, even if neither of us could name it. By the time we left the pool, the sun had set, and the air was cooler, tinged with the faintest hint of an evening breeze. We didn't talk much on the drive home, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't heavy or awkward, it was companionable, a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted between us. As I lay in bed that night, the cool sheets against my sun-warmed skin, I couldn't stop thinking about the pool, about the way Dad had looked at me, about the stories he'd shared, about the strange and unfamiliar sense of connection that had blossomed between us. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain. That summer was going to be different. The days that followed our first swim together at the pool felt surreal. It wasn't as if Dad and I suddenly became best friends or spent every waking moment bonding. Instead, there was an unspoken agreement between us, a quiet acknowledgement that we'd both taken a step towards something new, something unfamiliar. We started going to the pool more often, not every day, but enough for it to become a routine. Each visit had its own rhythm. Some days we swam laps side by side, the water pulling us into its calming embrace. Other days we lounged in the shade, letting the sounds of splashing and laughter fill the silences between us. It wasn't about what we did or said. It was about the act of being there together, sharing a space we'd previously navigated separately. One afternoon, the pool was unusually quiet. The usual cacophony of kids' laughter and lifeguards' whistles was subdued, replaced by the gentle ripple of water under the afternoon sun. I was floating on my back, staring up at the sky, when Dad's voice broke through my thoughts. "You're a natural," he said, treading water a few feet away. "Much better than I was at your age." I turned my head toward him, surprised by the compliment. He chuckled, a low, soft sound that felt rare and precious. "Doesn't mean I was good. I just liked the water." It's different when you enjoy something for yourself, rather than trying to impress someone else. The comment hung in the air between us, heavier than it seemed at first. I wanted to ask who he'd been trying to impress, but something in his expression stopped me. Instead, I let the silence stretch, filling it with the gentle bobbing of the water around us. Later that day, as we dried off in the warm sun, I found myself asking a question I hadn't planned to. "Do you miss it?" "Swimming, I mean." Dad looked at me, his face thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but life has a way of pulling you in different directions. It's easy to lose track of the things you love when you're busy trying to keep everything else together." There was a weight to his words that made my chest tighten. It was the kind of answer that hinted at something deeper, something unsaid. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, hoping he'd continue. "You know," he said after a moment, "when I was your age, I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I'd go to college, make a name for myself, maybe even swim professionally. But things change. You meet people, take on responsibilities, and suddenly the plans you made for yourself don't seem as important anymore. Do you regret it?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the shimmering surface of the pool. Not regret, exactly, but there are times I wonder what might have been if I'd made different choices. It was the most candid he'd ever been with me, and it left me feeling both closer to him and more distant at the same time. I'd always thought of Dad as unshakable, someone who didn't dwell on what-ifs or second guesses. Hearing him admit to those feelings made him seem more human, but it also made me realize how little I truly knew about him. Over the next few weeks, our trips to the pool became more frequent. Each visit felt like peeling back another layer of a story I'd never known existed. Dad began to share bits and pieces of his past, small anecdotes that painted a picture of a man who'd once been as full of dreams and uncertainties as I was. "You know, my first job was at a pool just like this one," he said one day as we sat on the edge, our feet dangling in the water. "Lifeguard. Worst summer of my life." I laughed. "Why? Sounds like an easy gig." "You'd think so," he said with a wry smile. "But try dealing with screaming kids and overbearing parents for 8 hours a day. It'll make you question every life choice you've ever made." I couldn't help but grin at the image of my dad, then a teenager, sitting in a lifeguard chair with a whistle around his neck, trying to keep order. It was such a far cry from the man I knew now, and yet it made perfect sense. "What about you?" he asked, turning the conversation back to me. "Any big plans for the future?" The question caught me off guard. I'd thought about college, about leaving Maplewood and starting fresh somewhere new, but I hadn't really talked to anyone about it. "I'm not sure yet," I said, trying to sound casual. "I guess I'll figure it out as I go." Dad nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's not a bad plan. Just make sure you leave room for the things that matter." The way he said it made me think he wasn't just talking about me. There was a wistfulness in his tone, a quiet reminder that life doesn't always go the way you expect it to. As summer rolled on, the pool became more than just a place to escape the heat. It became a sanctuary, a space where Dad and I could exist without the weight of our usual roles. In the water, he wasn't just my father. He was someone who'd lived a life full of twists and turns, someone who carried regrets and hopes and dreams just like I did. And for the first time, I felt like I was beginning to understand him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Dad and I stayed in the pool long after everyone else had gone. We floated side by side, not speaking, just letting the moment stretch between us. "You're a good kid, you know that?" he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I glanced over at him, surprised. "Thanks," I said, my voice just as soft. "You're not so bad yourself." He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that echoed across the empty pool. And in that moment, with the stars beginning to appear overhead and the water gently lapping around us, I felt something shift between. It wasn't just a father and son at the pool anymore. It was two people, sharing a connection that neither of us fully understood, but both of us felt deep. The pool, once just a backdrop to our summer days, had become a place where walls came down, where the unspoken could finally find its. And as the days grew shorter and the nights cooler, I found myself looking forward to each visit, knowing that with every lap, every shared sight, we were moving closer to something neither of us had known we were missing. As the summer rolled on, the routines Dad and I had built at the pool became our new normal. The unspoken connection between us deepened with each passing day. Yet, even as we shared stories and moments of laughter, there was an underlying sense that something was still left unsought, a veil that neither of us dared to lift entirely. That was when Dad surprised me with an idea that shattered the predictability of our days. It was a Saturday morning, the kind of bright and breezy day that made even the most mundane tasks feel lighter. I was lounging on the porch with a glass of iced tea when Dad stepped outside, car keys jingling in his hand. "Get your suit," he said, a glimmer of something uncharacteristically mischievous in his eyes. "Why? We're not heading to the pool now, are we?" I asked, eyeing him warily. "Not the pool," he replied, his tone cryptic. "I've got a better idea." Curiosity piqued, I grabbed my swim trunks and followed him to the car. As we drove out of town, the familiar streets gave way to winding country roads, their edges lined with wildflowers and sprawling fields. The air felt fresher out here, less saturated with the noise and heat of the town. Still, Dad offered no explanation, leaving me to piece together the mystery on my own. "We're not driving to the middle of nowhere to teach me some life lesson, are we?" I joked, half expecting him to pull out a speech about the importance of hard work or resilience. He chuckled. "Not this time. Just trust me." After an hour of driving, we arrived at Lake Wren, a serene expanse of water surrounded by tall pines and rocky shores. It was a place I'd heard about but never visited, a hidden gem that felt worlds away from the bustling community pool. The lake was quiet, save for the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. "Wow," I muttered, stepping out of the car and taking in the view. "I didn't even know this place existed." "It's been here a long time," Dad said, grabbing a cooler from the trunk. "My dad used to bring me here when I was your age." Thought it might be time to pass on the tradition. The idea of Dad as a teenager, visiting this very spot with my grandfather, made me pause. It was hard to imagine him as anything other than the steady, reliable figure I'd always known. Yet here he was, sharing a piece of his past with me. We spent the day exploring the lake. Dad had packed a small inflatable kayak, which we took turns paddling across the calm water. We stopped at a rocky outcrop to eat sandwiches and skipstones, competing to see who could make the most skips. For once, he let himself loose without much protest, his laugh echoing across the lake as I celebrated my victory. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the water, we found ourselves sitting on the edge of a dock, our feet dangling just above the surface. The quiet was different, hairless, a gap to be filled, and more a presence to be embraced. "You know," Dad said, breaking the silence, "I used to come here to think. When life felt overwhelming, or when I needed to clear my head, this was my escape." I glanced at him, his face softened by the golden light. "What did you need to escape from?" He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the rippling water. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. It was rare for Dad to admit to struggling with anything. He always seemed so solid, so unshakable. Hearing him talk about his younger self, about the weight he'd carried, made me see him in a new light. "It's weird to think about you being human," I said, my attempt at humor falling flat under the weight of the moment. He smirked. "I hate to break it to you, but I've always been human, just not always good at showing it." We sat there for a while, the stillness of the lake wrapping around us. It felt like one of those rare moments where time slows, where the world seems to hold its breath. And in that quiet, I found the courage to ask something that had been lingering in the back of my mind all summer. "Dad, do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" His brow furrowed, and for a moment, I thought I'd pushed too far. But then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "Sometimes, but wishing doesn't change much. What matters is what you do with where you are now." His words stayed with me as we packed up and headed back to the car. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of silence that had filled our drives before. This was different. It was comfortable, like we'd both let down a wall we hadn't realized was there. That trip to Lake Wren became a turning point, not just for the summer, but for our relationship. It was the first time I felt like I truly knew my dad, not just as the man who paid the bills and fixed the leaky faucet, but as someone who had dreams and someone who'd lived a life full of twists and turns just like I was starting. As we pulled into the driveway, the porch light flickering on to greet us, Dad turned to me, his expression softer than I'd ever. "Thanks for coming with me today," he said. "It meant a lot." I nodded, my chest tightening, with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "Yeah, me." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something. The summer wasn't just about the pool or the lake, or even the heat that seemed to hang in the air like a second skin. It was about finding something I hadn't even known I was looking for. A connection, a bridge to the person my dad had been, and the person he was still becoming. And for the first time, I felt like I was ready to meet. The final days of summer arrived in a golden haze, each sunset painting the skies in hues of orange and pink, as if the season itself didn't want to say goodbye. The pool remained a refuge, but the energy had shifted. The chatter of kids and splashes of cannonballs grew quieter as the season waned, leaving behind a space that felt almost sacred, a place where Dad and I had come to understand each other in ways we never had before. On one of those evenings, as the cicadas began their song, Dad and I found ourselves alone at the pool. The lifeguards had packed up for the day, and the water shimmered like liquid glass in the fading light. It was the kind of quiet that invited reflection, the kind where every sound felt amplified, the soft lap of the water against the tiles, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, even our own breaths as we sat at the edge of the pool. "This is probably our last swim for a while," Dad said, breaking the silence. His voice carried a weight I couldn't quite place. "Why?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. School was starting soon, and with it would come the rush of schedules and responsibilities that always seemed to pull us away from moments like these. He gave a small shrug. "Life gets busy. You'll have classes, college applications, friends. It's how it. There was a wistfulness in his tone, a subtle acknowledgement of the inevitable. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I'd never thought about how much these quiet evenings meant to him, how they had become as much a part of his summer as they had. We can still come back, I said, trying to reassure both him and myself. Maybe on weekends. He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. The air grew heavier, the kind of heaviness that comes when words are left unspoken. I felt the need to say something, to close the distance that had once seemed insurmountable, but now felt so fragile. Dad, I began, my voice softer than I'd intended. Thanks for everything this summer. It's been different, in a good way. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Pride, maybe, or understanding, or both. You've grown up a lot, he said. More than I realized. I'm glad we had this time together. It's something I'll carry with. The words hit me harder than I expected. Dad wasn't one for sentimental speeches, and hearing him say that made everything feel more real, more significant. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. And we sat there for a while longer, letting the silence speak for us. Eventually, he stood and walked to the diving board, a faint smile playing on his lips. One last dive? He asked, his tone lighter. I grinned. We spent the next hour, racing, diving, and reliving the games we'd played when I was younger. It felt like time had folded in on itself, like the years that had created distance between us had melted away, leaving only the pure, unfiltered joy of being together. When the last rays of sunlight disappeared, and the pool lights flickered on, Dad climbed out of the water and grabbed his towel. I followed, the cool air sending a shiver down my spine as we packed up our things. The weight of the evening settled over me, bittersweet and lingering. As we walked to the car, I felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, sadness, hope. I thought about how different the summer had been, how it had brought us closer in ways I hadn't thought possible. And I realized that even though the season was ending, what we'd built wouldn't fade. Hey, Dad, I said as we reached. He turned to look at me, his expression expectant. Let's do this again. Not just next summer, but whenever. We don't have to wait for the... His smile was small, but genuine, and he nodded. I'd like... The drive home was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, one filled with the promise of something lasting. As the town's lights came into view, I felt a sense of peace settle over. This summer had been more than just a break from routine. It had been a turning point, a reminder that connections real, meaningful, honest take time and effort, but are worth every... When we pulled into the driveway, Dad rested a hand on my shoulder before stepping out of the car. You've made this summer one to remember, he said, his voice warm. Thank... I didn't know how to respond, so I just smiled and nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. As I watched him walk toward the house, I realized something. This wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one built on understanding, respect, and a bond that could weather whatever came next. And as the door closed behind him, I stood there for a moment, under the soft glow of the porch light, and let the weight of the summer, its lessons, its memories, its quiet, transformative power wash over me. The pool might have been the catalyst, but what we'd found extended far beyond its cool, chlorinated water. It was a connection that would stay with us, shaping the seasons to come.